welcome back to a video on a spaceship after a very long time. But this will be a bit different to my older videos because I wanted to talk about this fan art I made of a lightship, one of the mysterious and powerful vessels used by the alien Advari in the Sojourn Audio Drama. This is the first 3D render I'm really genuinely proud of, so I felt like talking about the process behind it and all the learning and growing that went on because I am far from an expert at this. But this won't just be about the art. I'm also going to go over some of the lore and design of the ship itself, and what I think it really is, which all feeds back into the ideas I had for the art. Firstly, let's talk about why I even wanted to make art of this specific ship. I mean, yeah, it looks cool, but really the Lightship is the whole reason I stuck around to listen to more of the Sojourn beyond the first episode, which I think I listened to on YouTube while it was available as a try it before you buy it sort of thing a few years ago. I was pulled in by the mystery of what was going on in CDC-41 Gamma, the peculiar nebula that the first season of the show is set in, and this ship was at the heart of it. So naturally I wanted to recreate my own version of it. But there were some issues with that, the first one being my own lack of skill. There was a gap between what was in my head and what I was capable of, since before this project I'd only done a couple of other Sojourn ships, but those were both made of flat, angular parts. I hadn't done anything really curved before, so this was a good challenge, and I was never going to get better without pushing myself to do something new. The other issue was that there's very little reference to use. At the time I made this, there was in fact just one piece of official art where you can really see any of the ship, and it's this one here where it's looming over some human ships as they attempt to evade it by hiding in the clouds of a gas giant. At the time I made it, there was only one other place the Lightship showed up at all, which was this head-on shot in the distance in the trailer for the audio drama. That's it, just two pictures. Luckily, there was also the official art for the Imin Daraka, a lightship of a different scale, age, and design to the one I was going to make. But those differences also mean the details are not necessarily applicable to the big lightship, but I'll go over that more in a bit. Because of the difficulty in using the official art as a reference, I needed some more inspiration, which came from three places. These were the movie Treasure Planet, a real-life item I have, and something from a real type of ship. It should be fairly obvious why the first one is used, because it's probably where the idea for the glowy hexagonal grid on Lightship sails comes from. The other two I'll reveal later. So that's the inspiration and references, but what even is the Lightship, and what other ideas can we glean from that? In the setting, they're huge, extremely powerful warships used by the Advari, the mostly belligerent denizens of the mysterious CDC-41 Gamma. But I don't think they were always like that. My theory is that sometime before the Advari's current status quo, these huge ships were used for more benign stuff. Like maybe they were cargo ships or something in that vicinity, perhaps colony ships. Then they got their hugely powerful beam weapons added to them later in life, perhaps even made by the ships themselves, since they do seem to have auto-forge systems. And those things do fit in nicely with the colony ship idea, allowing the ships to make stuff for the colony it transported, in a similar manner to the Spirit of Fire from Halo. Then the self-repair function they also have is just part of that. Another reason for me thinking they're converted cargo ships is the way the other largest ships in the setting are also all cargo ships. Things like the massive Mauritian treasure ships and big-ass gate haulers all seem bigger than the various human warships flying around, lining up with how such things are scaled in real life. But the huge scale of the Lightships is very out of proportion to everything else. They are truly humongous. There's no exact measurements out there, but these things have got to be up in the kilometers range. They really are utterly gigantic things, and come to think of it, a lot of what's going on in the nebula breaks the rules, so perhaps their vast size is just meant to show their power and accentuate the difference between humans and Advari. That would fit in with the overall alien and fantastical nature of the nebula, which is also something I used later on for the finishing touches of my art. But that's jumping a gun a bit, since I've not even told you about starting yet, which began at the hull, starting with this middle dark bit, which was pretty simple, but it's definitely not a one-to-one copy. Like these curved bits, I had some ideas for how they would link to the sails, but more on that later. The real nightmare was making the curves for the main parts of the hull, since it was important to get the shape right and have the geometry work in such a way that I could easily build out some golden trim from it. And yeah, I exaggerated the size and thickness of the trim to stand out more. It is there on the trailer art as a thin line, unless I'm imagining it, and the smaller flyers that these ships deploy do have their own strips of trim too. Overall, this section was a bit of a pain to make and took a few tries to get mostly right. But like I said earlier, I'm not used to working with curved surfaces like this. It's still a bit janky, but it doesn't matter because it looks good in the end product. I don't really work linearly on my projects. I don't do all the geometry and then do the textures. I like to hop back and forth between the two to help realize the project as it goes. So, after I got the shape of the curved hull, I went in and had a go at replicating the second one of my main inspirations, the real-life object I have, which is this seashell. I see this every day and wanted the big outer hull sections to resemble it. It's very interesting and it was grown organically. In that degree, it fits with the self-repair thing the lightships have going on as well. I'm sure there's some other things bouncing around in my head that have had unconscious influence over this combination of white and gold, like the Orokin style from Warframe or the Amar ships in EVE. Armed with this reference object, I could work on the material itself. A material in a 3D art context is the appearance of the various meshes, its colour, how shiny it is, how metallic it is, and sometimes other things like if it glows, if it's transparent, or if light can scatter within it. And to be honest, I never actually finished this shell material. I got it into a pretty good state, which works fine for the final render idea I settled on, which I'll cover later. Because it's unfinished, this shell is actually pretty simple. There's a distorted wave texture to get large-scale ridges, which has some noise mixed in to break it up a little bit. The waves drive the two slightly different tones of the shell and a bit of variation in the roughness to make the tops of the ridges shine a bit more. And then there's a bit of displacement to make the ridges actually stick up and out. I think this may be backwards, but hey, it's unfinished. I got it to a decent state for a first pass and then moved on to some other part of the ship. This next part was supposed to be improving the rear of the hull. The idea of this shape was to evoke the stern or quarterdeck area of Age of Sail ships. You can see this in Treasure Planet, but really there's just so much Age of Sail all over the Sojourn, I may as well just directly use that for reference. And these are big sailing ships, so why not put something with a visual resemblance to a quarterdeck on there? But beyond having that general idea, I was just clueless as to how to actually implement it. And since you can't really see that part of the ship in the render angle I liked, the stern of the ship just got shoved off into do later land. Or really, do never, but hey, maybe I'll take a crack at it in the future. Another thing I had a crack at doing, but which ultimately never panned out, was the trench between the shells. I had a lot of ideas for this place, most of which were inspired by architecture, but I'm not counting this as one of the mystery influences because none of it ended up in the final model. I just couldn't make it work. The whole reason I wanted anything in the gap is because this space is massive. My model is only around 1 kilometer long, so it's probably a lot smaller than it should be, but even at that size, look how big the trench is. That dude is Jimothy Scaleman, by the way, my crude size reference for an average human height. It's handy to have something like this around for keeping an eye on the scale of things. The biggest idea I had to fill this gap was some form of tiles or curved panels, based on the things you see in Art Deco and Neo-Art Deco on the outside of buildings, particularly these ones going up the sides of 111 West 57th Street in New York. I imagined that behind the tiles would be things like launch bays and weapon emplacements and stuff like that. But the tiles ended up being either so small you couldn't tell there was anything even there, or so big they looked like giant goofy teeth. So like the stern of the ship, the trench detail got relegated to do later land. After those failures, I worked on something that had to be in the final thing and did a first pass on the masts and sails. This was mostly just to get them in to see how the ship looked with them on, and so I could work on the sail material. Since these are such a big and visible part of the lightship, I was keen to get these looking good. And yeah, these sails are absolutely gigantic, even on this scaled interpretation of the ship. Obviously, the most important part of the sails was their material. It's here that the hexagon pattern and glow are defined, and I could have just used a pre-made tiling hex texture, but wanted a little more control over how other elements of the material interacted with the hexagons. So I used this procedural hexagon tutorial from Left Brained CG Art, which is full of maths to create the hexes themselves, but it's all in service of outputting multiple masks for the hexes and the invisible mathematical grid they sit on. One notable change here compared to the references is that the hexagons on my interpretation are a lot smaller, because I felt like the huge hexes on a huge ship sent the wrong idea about the thing's size. It seems like the official hexes are this big just to be visible at all in the trailer, because the ship there is far away. But since that wasn't going to be the case for mine, I could get away with making the hexes a lot smaller while they still remain visible. That final scale isn't even really small either, because they're still way larger than a person. Speaking of references, this is where Ethan Leroy's model of Imendarica comes in. This ship is from Faithless, the one-off spin-off of the audio drama that's on Nebula. And there's a lot going on in the beautiful sails of this that I wanted to emulate. If we take a closer look at these sails, it looks like there's two elements to them. There's the netting or framework that also glows, and then the hexes of the sail itself, which also have their own little bit of repeating details. That procedural hex system I used shows its worth here because it has all of the outputs needed to get these separate elements, making it very easy for me to set the different base colours and reflectivity for each of them. Having access to the mathematical grid that hexagons are following also makes it very simple to set up that bit of repeating noise seen on each hex. Because I was feeling fancy, I also wanted to try to spice up the hexes by adding some subtle anisotropy to them, which is the peculiar way that reflections work on circular brushed metal. I couldn't get it to work though, so settled for some little circular patterns you can't even see in the final thing. But now you know it's there. I also added a little bit of bump mapping to the framework to make it pop out and seem more like it was a physical net that provides support to all of the flat sail hexes. I really love this effect because even on parts of the sail that are out of direct light and not glowing, that raised framework catches reflected or emitted light from the other sails in interesting ways. I did also experiment with having the sails be a bit transparent like on the gas giant reference, but I didn't like how that looked and it kind of felt strange having a light sail that let light through. With the main sail material done, I moved on to the real star of the show, the massive fiery glow. We see this in the very first time the lightship is shown, slowly pulsing outward from the hull. I haven't got a clue what the energy is meant to represent, like it could be waste heat or perhaps a magic space tech multiplier for light to push the sails harder, or maybe it's just there to look cool. Whatever it is, it seems pretty likely that Treasure Planet was the inspiration for this effect. Much like how I altered the scale of the hexes, I really wanted to push the size and detail seen in the energy waves, building on what's seen on Imendarica and making it feel much grander in scope. So to get that, the glow is made from a couple different types of noise mixed in a couple of different ways to get that nice fiery feel with bright spots and lots of depth. This fire is then mixed with a wobbly wave texture to set its location on the scales so it's not just everywhere at once, and was overall a huge pain in the aft to get looking exactly how I wanted it to. And yeah, as with all my materials, I like to keep things at least semi-organised and labelled with frames so I know what's what. Lastly, the good old procedural hex system gets plugged in here to mask the glow so that it only shows up on the framework, and all this gets routed into the final material to set how strong the glow is across the sails. Speaking of materials and Imendarica, I also had a bit of a go at making something that resembled its crazy swirling skin. This was just for fun more than anything else, since the lightship is simply way too large to see any detail like this without being right up next to it. It was a neat challenge that I just don't know enough node wizardry to complete, but I got decently close to a static version using parts of this Ryan King tutorial for making a procedural meat material. Sort of fitting really, given the self-repair stuff the ships have, and the organic shell material for the outer hull that I made. The question is, does it make sense to actually include this sort of swirling hull on the full-sized lightships? Possibly not, since that while Imendarica is a lot older than current Advari ships, it is implied in Faithless to be a lot more technologically advanced. So I guess my implementation that's worse than the real thing makes sense in a way. Either that or there's a copium leak around here somewhere. While I was thinking about that stuff, I did go back later and add this brick node to the basic dark part of the ship's hull, with the idea that this would emulate the look of wooden planking. I even got the swirling pattern to be separated over these planks too, another detail you can't possibly see without me pointing it out. With that task done, I played around with the gold trim a bit and then tried out some more lighting options, landing on something that I liked a lot. This backlit angle is all dramatic and mysterious, much like the ship itself. itself. It also very conveniently hid a lot of that detailing I was starting to think I was never going to get around to, so that's a plus. You can also see the volumetric fog I was experimenting with too, and yeah, it doesn't make sense to see this in space, but it does look cool when you see the shadows in it. This was also when I started messing around with the composite a bit, adding in some glare and a vignette. Just basic stuff so I'd have a better idea of what the final thing might look like with this lighting. The background here is just a couple types of noise in the world. The stars are Voronoi and the nebula is just basic noise that's been swirled up a bit. But neither of these ended up in the final render, so that's getting ahead of myself since the next bit I did was go back to the hull and try to add in more details. This was mostly just to fill out some of the big flat areas on the core, mostly just more bits that could catch the light and gleam a little. But I was still stumped as to what form these should take. I ended up stealing some ideas from Advari clothing with these lines, but in general I was still a bit lost. I was paralysed in the realm of wanting to add something, but with no idea what it should really be that would fit the style. Would greeblies work? If so, what sort of thing should they be? How much of the dark hull should be detailed like that? To my eye, the Lightship desperately needs more things to really make it feel its size, since right now all three of the Advari ships are so clean and smooth they end up lacking scale markers. You can pretty much line them all up next to each other and not really know how they relate to each other in terms of size. Even Imendarica, which actually does have a scale marker in the form of its ramp, is still inconclusive. Is it a ramp like this, or a ramp like this? But then the other side of the coin here is that this lack of detail and scale markers works to accentuate the mysterious nature of the Advari and the place they inhabit. It makes their ships and them feel more alien and unknowable. Lots of wrestling and indecision over this detail problem is a big reason why I was so drawn to this dramatic backlit angle for the final render, and why I also ended up going into the sails to spruce them up, and to use that last mystery inspiration from earlier. Before I could work on the sails, I had to redo the placeholder masts, which took a lot of their shape from the various Treasure Planet ships. The yards on those all have this neat tapering shape with pointy ends that goes past where the sails end, so I used that and stuck it on some big, chunky, triangular masts. Why triangular? I just didn't like the idea of circular masts that's on the reference. Not much else to that. And they link to the ship's hull on these neat rotating parts I mentioned earlier as well. No idea if the official Lightships can do that, but it's a cool idea, so I did it. After finalising the masts, I experimented a bit with the sails to make them a bit more interesting than just a big flat plane with a texture on it. So I stole another thing from the RLS Legacy in Treasure Planet and put a bit of billowing into the sails. The thing is, the Legacy's sails are visibly cloth-like, and that ship is way smaller than a Lightship is, so I felt like the light sails could do with a bit of extra reinforcement. And the big reveal of the last mystery inspiration is junk rigging, since I took the battens from those and added them to the light sails, and these also taper on the outside just like the masts. These battens also connect down into the rotating joints on the hull, but the sails themselves leave a little gap in this part, mostly just because this was an awkward area. But it ended up looking neat and providing a touch more visual interest, particularly on the really wide, fan-shaped sail on the dorsal and ventral surfaces. The material of the sails was also tweaked to fit better on the final sail models, getting the glow in the correct spot and also scaling down the hexes even more. I'm really happy with these. The reflected sunlight and glow between the two sets of sails looks really cool, with the billowed shape and bump map hexes making them look a lot more detailed than they really are. At this point, the model for the ship is basically done. Well, I mean, not done, because there's a bunch of unfinished stuff all over it, but it's done enough for the camera angle and lighting I'm going to use. But I still wasn't really happy with the basic background. The yellow of it sits in the same colour range as the gold trim and orange glow, so I switched it up to blue and tweaked the noise of the nebula cloudy stuff to try to get it looking better. I got something I was somewhat okay with and started looking around for some ideas for better compositing for the final render. This means the post-process effects applied to the render, like glare on bright parts and all sorts of other stuff like that subtle vignette I'd added already. this stage of the process is also where you combine together all sorts of different render passes and even add whole other elements from different renders. Most of this is beyond my needs and skills though, but I did want to see what tricks were out there. And in the process of that search, I found this very cool video from Jeremy Vickery, who has decades of film industry experience and shares it on YouTube and his own website. Now, this video isn't about compositing, it's largely about lighting, particularly about how the best shots you see in cinema work so well because they are easy on the eyes. So, armed with this mindset, I set out to improve the lighting on my lightship, because yeah, it is dramatic with the silhouette angle, but it's still very basic. I used my same old strategy of replicating the real space environment by using a single harsh light source, with maybe a bit of coloured planet shine from a lower intensity soft light from a different angle. This setup works fine, but it's a bit dull and sterile, but importantly, it was lacking in intentionality. I used this because that's what I use, without much thought behind it. Luckily, I had already started moving away from that with the backlit angle, intentionally hiding the details of the ship and keeping it feeling mysterious. This also lined up a little with one of the lessons from that video, in that the shine on the top of the shell highlights the ship's form. There was also the glow and reflected light from the sails, which filled things in a bit, particularly here along the gold trim. But I wanted to push that idea of form even further, so I added in more rim lights around the ship to really pick out the edges of the hull. While there's still the powerful main sunlight responsible for the bright rim lighting on the top of the shell, there is also a lower power one on the back at the bottom, one on the front at the bottom, and even one on the nose of the ship to pick out the gold trim. I also tweaked the general contrast and brightness here, and you can really see the difference between the previous single source of light and the more intentional multiple source lighting. It's so much easier to see the form of the hull beyond the previous single lit edge, and to me it makes the ship feel more sword-like, which goes along with the way they're used by the Advari. It's kinda like the fantasy-inspired version of the sci-fi staple spaceship that looks like a gun from Aliens and Halo. There was a bit of a problem with this new lighting though. It made the ship pop so well that the basic noise for the background just didn't live up to it. Yes, the focus should be on the ship itself, but I felt like this basic background was too basic and detracted from it all. But when I was looking around for tips on amping up the compositing, my mate Dennis showed me Alaskan FX's YouTube channel, which has some really fantastic tutorials on doing space stuff in Blender, like black holes and gas giants, sometimes with the assistance of external programs. One of those programs is IFS Renderer, which makes some crazy looking fractals. With the right settings, these can actually end up looking like pretty good and very high detail nebulae, which is perfect. After getting that set up, I did try to get it to work in the world as an HDRI, which is basically the sky in every direction, but at the time I just couldn't get the blasted thing to expose correctly. Turns out the texture nodes just don't work in that way. Plus, to actually look any good, the HDRI texture would have to be obscenely high resolution and many gigabytes in size. So because of those issues, I just ended up finding a particularly pleasant looking part of the nebula in IFS and rendering out a static background image instead. That then gets composited in behind the lightship, and I can actually set the correct exposure and brightness in the compositor. After that, it was just a matter of finalising the composite and getting it looking real nice. There's a good chunk of this Robin Squares tutorial on getting the film look out of the compositor, but I didn't want to fully go for that look, so I only used part of it. The main goal was to get a nice balance between the background and the ship, but also to try to inject a bit of a dreamy, soft focus look to it. This is a very deliberate attempt to emulate old fantasy movies, particularly Excalibur. Since the Advari and the CDC-41 Gamma Nebula have this fantasy slant to them, it seems fitting to use this sort of visual style to heighten that feeling. And it's also pretty fitting to use that movie as an inspiration, given all the Arthurian legend stuff throughout the Sojourn. One thing that helped a lot here was using one of the many little glare node setups I had, since just one is too simple, and imitating the star filters used on cameras to get this spiky look on bright spots. It's important to note that the stars get their own little set of glares to get this effect before they're added into the main composition, because the glare setup when applied to both at once just doesn't look good. In the end, I'm not sure if I truly nailed the dreamy fantasy look, but I do think I got most of the way there, and in a way that does actually add to the image. That is why I'm proud of this one. It may be a relatively simple model with lots of missing details, but the way that the warm glow, dramatic lighting and fantasy composite all come together make that not matter. When taken together, it all sells the Lightship as being otherworldly and mysterious, bringing out all the feelings I had about this ship from the very first time I listened to the Sojourn. One of my aims with this project was to push myself out of my artistic comfort zone to try new things, since, well, I'm never going to learn and improve as an artist if I don't. Beyond the technical stuff, one of the biggest lessons for me was being more intentional with what I was doing. The lighting and compositing is where that mostly comes through, but it's also there in some details of the design, like with the sails. A different side of this intentionality is from choosing where to focus my time and attention, which I did an okay job of, I guess? Yeah, I spent time working on materials that you can't see, but I also saved time by not finishing the aft or details of the main hull. As part of that, I made an effort to learn to accept and be happy when things are good enough, rather than spending ages going too deep on details that are unnecessary for the final product. That was something I had real trouble with on my previous project, the Temptress class, which I ended up spending ages on. Sure, I built skills by doing that stuff, but I could have just as easily built those skills on another project, though at least I can reuse some of what I made for other things. The joys of digital art. One of the other benefits, or curses, of digital art is being able to just go right back in and change anything you like, which raises the question of what I might change or do differently now, given the benefit of hindsight and new references of the Lightship to use. The first one is changing the colour of the background to better fit the cyan or turquoise shade of CDC 41 Gamma. To be honest, I probably should have clocked this on the I'm in Daraka art, but I just didn't for some reason, though this is by far the easiest thing to change. Just put in a little hue shift on the background asset in the composite and there, it's done. The next least involved change is doing a different material for the shell, since official Lightship art by Ethan Leroy has this sort of metallic looking vibe going on. I even had a quick go at making something like that on the Advari flyer art I did for a quick weekend project. I definitely didn't get all the way there with this because it was meant to be just a speedy little thing, and I also had to learn how to make gas giants in the deadline I set for myself. The major thing I would do is have another go at the trench detail with the tiles. I think one of the things I missed here is that tiles are not just there by themselves when used in architecture, they have other elements around them. I think with these, better scaling and using the same dark hull material, that issue I had with a toothy look could be mitigated. One thing to note though is that I wouldn't consider the tiles to be gun ports that concealed weapon emplacements anymore, because in one of the new animations, this Lightship's hull starts to glow before it goes off screen, and then a big beam weapon fires. That makes me think the hull itself is the weapon emitter, but it could also be a slightly weird looking bit of specular highlight, I guess? Another mystery. The last thing I would try is to put more effort into lens simulation. That means better lens flares and stuff like that, but since I have no idea where to start with this, I don't know how much effort it would take. I've got to do more research here and see what options are out there, since it's possible to do this both directly in render and just in the composite. Which way is better? Which way is faster? How much do add-ons for this cost? And are there free options? Things like that. I hope you enjoyed this behind-the-scenes look at how I made my Advari Lightship. I think sharing the whys and hows of how we make art is very important these days with all the soulless slop that Gen AI outputs. Art is about far more than just the end product. It's also about the process and all of the thoughts and feelings that influence the art as it is being made. I'd even argue that's what makes it art and not just content to be endlessly consumed. If you want to see the art directly, I'll repost it on my Blue Sky for you to check out. I'll also put it on my brand new Patreon as a free post, but you can also subscribe there to support me, which I will be eternally grateful for. I plan to do more videos here on this channel, and there will be previews of that upcoming content as it happens. For now, there's also a short little video about my new intro. Thanks for listening, and thanks for supporting if you do, and I'll see you next time.